The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation, a scent that clung to the worn vinyl chairs and the faded inspirational posters on the walls. Liam sat on the edge of his seat, one hand resting gently on his daughter's good arm, his other thumb rubbing a frayed hole in the knee of his jeans, like the motion might somehow wear away the knot of fear in his chest. Maya, his 8-year-old daughter, sat beside him, her left arm cradled in a makeshift sling, a bright blue cast peeking out from beneath a superhero bandage the emergency room doctor had applied with a kind smile. She was being brave, far braver than he felt. Her small face was pale, but her eyes were wide and curious, taking in the hushed conversations and the rhythmic beep of distant machines. A few chairs away, a woman sat alone. She was unremarkable at first glance, dressed in a simple gray coat and dark jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a loose knot, and she held a book in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page. In the 20 minutes Liam had been watching, she just stared at the wall, her expression unreadable, a mask of placid stillness that seemed out of place in a room humming with so much contained. Panicked Liam turned his attention back to Maya. He smoothed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, trying to pour all the calm he didn't feel into the simple gesture, "You doing okay, kiddo?" Maya nodded, her gaze fixed on the cast. "I think it looks like a robot arm," she whispered, a little proud. He forced a chuckle. "A superhero robot arm. Then the best kind," she giggled, and the sound was a small, bright thing in the sterile quiet of the room, but it didn't reach the cold place. In Liam's stomach, he had $217 in his bank account and a stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter that felt a mile high. He worked as a carpenter, a good one, but work had been slow. The last few months, a broken arm. This visit, the x-rays, the cast. It was a tidal wave. He had no idea how to outrun the receptionist, called his name. Her voice flat and indifferent. Liam's heart gave a hard thud. He squeezed Maya's hand, gently stood, and walked toward the counter, trying to keep his shoulders straight, trying to look like a man who wasn't about to be swept under. He didn't notice the woman in the gray coat finally look away from the wall, her gaze following him, with a flicker of something that wasn't just curiosity, it was recognition. Not of him, but of the particular brand of quiet fear he wore like a second skin. The discharge papers felt flimsy in Liam's hands, a stark contrast to the screef. "Wait," they carried. He signed. Where the receptionist pointed his signature, a shaky line that betrayed the tremor in his fingers. Maya stood beside him, clutching a small stuffed bear. A nurse had given her. Her eyes were heavy with fatigue, but she still managed a sleepy smile. When he glanced down at her, he returned it, but his own felt brittle like it might crack. The receptionist slid a folded sheet of paper across the counter. The bill, it was printed in cold black ink on stark white paper, and the number at the bottom made the air leave Liam's lungs in a silent rush. It was more than he made in 2 months, more than he could have saved in a year. It was an impossible number, a wall he had no way to climb. He stared at it for a long moment, the sounds of the waiting room fading into a dull roar in his ears, the beeping machines, the shuffling feet, the low murmur of conversations. It all receded until there was only that number, that figure that represented the vast chasm between the life he wanted for his daughter and the one he could actually provide. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Is there a—" He cleared his throat, trying again, his voice rough. "Is there a payment plan option?" The receptionist didn't look up from her screen. She slid a form toward him, her movements automatic, devoid of emotion. "You can fill this out. Financial assistance will review. It takes 4 to 6 weeks. Liam nodded slowly, taking the form. He knew what 4 to 6 weeks meant. It meant letters in red ink. It meant calls from numbers he didn't recognize. It meant another layer of shame to carry around. He folded the bill carefully, tucking it into his pocket like hiding it might somehow make it smaller. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He took Maya's hand and led to her toward the exit. His steps felt heavy, as if the weight of that paper had transferred directly to his bones. He didn't look back, didn't see the woman in the gray coat watching him. Her book forgotten in her lap, her placid expression now troubled by a deep furrow in her brow. She watched him walk away, a man trying to hold himself together for the sake of the little girl whose hand he held so tightly, and in his quiet dignity, she saw a reflection of a world she had fought to escape, a world where value was measured in numbers, and kindness was a luxury, not a reflex. The rain had started a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the pavement and blurred the streetlights into hazy coronas. Liam pulled the collar of his thin jacket tighter as he helped Maya into the passenger seat of his beat-up truck. The door groaned in protest as he closed. Put it a sound that seemed to echo the ache in his own body. He climbed into the driver's side and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The engine turned over with a reluctant cough, sputtering to life like it too was. Exhausted from the day, the hospital bill in his pocket felt like a stone pressing against his skin, a constant physical reminder of his failure. He glanced at Maya. She was already dozing, her head leaning against the window, the stuffed bear clutched to her chest. Her new cast looked stark and white. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, he had to be strong for her. He had to pretend that everything was okay, that the world wasn't a place of terrifying numbers and closing walls. But the pretense was wearing thin inside the hospital. Isabella Vance sat in the same chair, long after Liam and Maya had gone. The waiting room was quieter. Now the late-night lull settling in. She shouldn't have been here. She had a private physician, a team of specialists who would have come to her penthouse for a consultation on the minor sprain she'd sustained during a foolish morning run. But she had needed to feel anonymous to sit in a room with real sprain people and their real problems, to remember that the world existed outside of boardrooms and sterile glass towers. She had seen the look on Liam's face when he saw that bill. She knew that look not from personal experience, but from the bland to faces of the people who pitched their desperate dreams to her foundation, the flicker of hope extinguished by the harsh reality of cost, the quiet shame of having to ask for help. She had built an empire on calculated risks and strategic investments. But what she saw in that man wasn't a number. It was a father's love, a fierce, quiet protectiveness that asked for nothing and deserved everything. She stood up, her book slipping from her lap and landing on the floor with a soft thud. She didn't bother to pick it up. She walked to the billing counter, her steps silent and purposeful. The same receptionist looked up, her expression, shifting from boredom to surprise. Isabella Vance was not a face one easily forgot. Even when dressed in a simple coat and jeans, "I'd like to inquire about the bill for the young girl who just left," she said, her voice calm, and even the one with the broken arm. The receptionist blinked, then tapped at her keyboard. The Morgan account. Yes. Isabella slid a black credit card across the counter. "I'd like to pay it in full, and I'd like it to remain an anonymous donation from the Harbor Light Foundation." The receptionist stared at the card, then at Isabella, her mouth slightly agape. "But ma'am, the policy, I'm sure you can make an exception," Isabella said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was the same tone she used to close billion-dollar deals, and it worked just as effectively on a hospital policy. The transaction was silent and swift, and as Isabella walked out into the cold rain, she didn't feel like a billionaire or a CEO. She just felt a quiet spark of something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something dangerously close to hope. The phone call came. The next afternoon, Liam was in his workshop, a small rented space behind an old textile mill that smelled perpetually of sawdust and varnish. He was trying to finish 11-2 set of custom cabinets for a client, a job that would barely cover rent. But it was something his hands moved with practiced ease, sanding the edge of a piece of oak, but his mind was miles away, replaying the scene at the hospital, calculating numbers that never added up. His phone buzzed on the workbench. He glanced at the caller ID, a blocked number, and his stomach tightened. Another debt collector. He almost let it go to voicemail, But something made him answer. He wiped his hands on a rag and picked it up. His voice was cautious. "Hello, Mr. Morgan, Liam Morgan," a cheerful voice on the other end asked. "This is Carol from the hospital's billing department. I'm just calling to follow up on your visit yesterday." Liam's grip on the phone tightened. "Look, I'm going to send in the paperwork for the payment plan. I just haven't had a chance yet." "There's no need for that, sir," the woman said brightly. "That's why I'm calling. Your account has been settled in full." Liam froze the piece of sandpaper, slipping from his fingers. "What settled?" she repeated. "It seems there was an anonymous donation made late last night through a charitable fund, the Harbor Light Foundation. Your balance is zero, Mr. Morgan? You don't owe anything." Liam sank onto a nearby stool, the wood smooth and cool beneath him. He couldn't process the words anonymous. He repeated. "Who would a donation from who? I'm sorry, sir. The information is confidential. The donor requested to remain private. All I can tell you is that it's taken care of. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Liam didn't answer. He just stared at the half-finished cabinet. In front of him, the grain of the wood, blurring through a sudden haze, he mumbled a thank you and hung up. The phone, the silence in the workshop, felt immense. Loud. He ran a hand through his hair trying to make sense of it. People like him didn't get anonymous. Donations, miracles didn't just fall from the sky into workshops that smelled of turpentine and quiet desperation. It had to be a mistake, a clerical error that would be corrected with another phone call, one that would bring the weight of that bill crashing back down. But as the hours passed and the phone remained silent, a different feeling began to creep in. Not relief, not yet, but a deep, unsettling curiosity. Who had been in that waiting room, who had seen his quiet despair and decided to erase it with a wave of a hand, and more importantly, why the park was damp. From the morning's rain, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and late autumn leaves. Maya was on the swings, her laughter echoing in the quiet Saturday air as she tried to kick her legs high enough to touch the sky. Her blue cast was a flash of color against the gray sky, a bright reminder of the storm they had just weathered. Liam sat on a nearby bench, watching her, a thermos of lukewarm coffee in his hands. He hadn't slept well. The anonymous donation had settled in his mind like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. It felt like a debt he couldn't repay, a kindness so large it was suffocating. He didn't like owing people anything, least of all, a stranger. He was so lost. In thought that he didn't notice the woman until she was standing a few feet away. She was dressed simply again, a dark green sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back, revealing a face that was more striking in the daylight than he remembered. She held a paper cup in her hands and looked hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she should be there. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. Her voice was the same one from the hospital waiting room. Calm and quiet, Liam stood up, instinctively, his posture guarded. "No, not at all," he said. Maya spotted her from the swings and her face lit up. "It's the quiet lady," she yelled, waving her good arm enthusiastically. Isabella smiled at Maya, a genuine soft smile that transformed her face. "You remember me?" Maya hopped off the swing and ran over. "You were reading a book but not really turning the pages." Isabella chuckled. "You're very observant." Liam watched the interaction, his mind racing. Was this a coincidence? It couldn't be. He met Isabella's eyes, and the question was there in his gaze, unspoken but clear. "I was just getting some air," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "I live near here." "Well, not here, but I'm staying nearby." Liam nodded slowly, still not convinced. "I'm Isabella." "By the way, Liam," he replied, shaking the hand. She offered. Her grip was firm, but her skin was soft, a contrast to his own calloused palm. They stood in a moment of awkward silence, until Maya tugged on Isabella's sleeve. "Did you make my arm better?" Isabella blinked, startled. "No, sweetheart, the doctors did that," but Maya shook her head. "No, Dad was sad, and then he wasn't. You were there when he was sad, and now you're here, and he's not as sad." Liam's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. He crouched down to Maya's level. "Hey, kiddo, it's not that simple." But Maya's simple logic hung in the air between them, a truth too innocent to be denied. Isabella looked at him, her eyes holding a new depth, a silent acknowledgement of the secret that lay between them, and in that moment, Liam knew this was no coincidence. She was the one the next few days. Unfolded in a series of cautious steps, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that Isabella's presence was a thread connected directly to the paid hospital bill, but he couldn't bring himself to ask. The words felt too accusatory, too ungrateful, and she offered no explanation. She just kept showing up, not in a way that felt intrusive, but with a quiet consistency that began to feel almost normal. She appeared at the park again the next day, this time with a small bag of pastries from a local bakery, which she shared with him, and Maya, without making a big deal of it. They sat on the bench and talked about things that didn't matter: the weather, the changing leaves, the way squirrels seemed to have a personal vendetta against his bird feeder. He learned that she was a writer, or at least that's what she told him, that she was on a sabbatical, trying to find inspiration away from the noise of the city. He didn't fully believe her. Her clothes were too well made, her posture too refined for a struggling artist. But he let it go because watching her with Maya was something he hadn't expected. Isabella didn't talk down to her. She listened intently when Maya explained the complex social hierarchy of the playground, and she helped her build a magnificent fort out of fallen branches and a discarded piece of cardboard. Her laughter was quiet at first, a reserved sound, but it grew more frequent, more genuine each time. Maya said something unabashedly honest. One afternoon she stopped by his workshop. Liam was surprised to see her standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the bright afternoon light. She held 2 cups of coffee and an expression that was a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I was in the area," she said, holding up the cups as a peace offering. "Thought you might need a break." He took one with a nod of thanks and watched as she stepped inside her eyes, roamed the space, taking in the stacks of wood, the half-finished projects, the organized chaos of his tools. He didn't wrinkle her nose at the smell of sawdust or flinch at the layer of dust that coated everything. Instead, she ran a hand over a piece of reclaimed barnwood. He was working on her touch, gentle, almost reverent. "This is beautiful," she said. "It's just wood," he replied. "But you make it into something more," she said, looking at him now. Her gaze direct and steady. "That's a gift." Liam didn't know what to say that he wasn't used to praise that felt so sincere, so unearned. They stood in the quiet of the workshop, the hum of the machinery, silent for once. And Liam felt a wall he hadn't even realized was there, to begin to crack just a little. He still didn't trust her, not completely, but he was starting to want to. The apartment was small, but it was theirs, a second-floor walk-up in a brick building that had seen better decades. Liam had done his best to make it a home. Shelves he'd built himself lined the walls, filled with Maya's books and art projects. A small, colorful rug covered the most scuffed part of the hardwood floor, and the kitchen table was a piece he'd salvaged and refinished himself when Isabella came over for dinner for the first time. Liam felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He had insisted on cooking a way of repaying her for the pastries and the coffee, a way of balancing a scale that felt impossibly tipped. He made spaghetti, his one foolproof meal, and Maya helped by setting the table with mismatched plates and carefully folded paper napkins. Isabella arrived with a small potted orchid, a splash of delicate beauty that looked both out of place and perfectly at home on his windowsill. She stepped inside, and her eyes didn't linger on the peeling paint by the window or the faucet that dripped, no matter how many times he fixed it. She looked at the photos of him and Maya taped to the fridge. She looked at the crayon drawings that served as wallpaper in the hallway, and she smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made the room feel warmer. "This is lovely," she said, and he knew she meant it. Dinner was simple and a little chaotic. Maya spilled her water twice and insisted on explaining the entire plot of her favorite movie. In excruciating detail, Liam felt himself apologizing for the noise, for the mess, but Isabella just laughed. "It's not messy," she said. "It's alive, her own apartment." She explained was always quiet, too quiet, a place where the silence echoed after she watched them together. Liam and Maya, their easy banter, their shared jokes, their unconditional love. He saw the longing in her eyes, a flicker of sadness, for something she didn't have later. After Maya was asleep, Isabella helped him with the dishes. She stood beside him at the small sink, her shoulder occasionally brushing his. As she dried a plate, their silence was comfortable, now filled with the unspoken things. They were both learning about each other. "You're a good father," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "I'm just trying not to mess it up too badly." "You're not," she said, turning to face him. "You're giving her something that no amount of money can buy. A home, a real one." Liam stopped wiping the plate in his hand and looked at her. Really looked at her, in the dim light of his small kitchen. She didn't look like a mystery anymore. She just looked like a woman who understood what it meant to be lonely. And in that shared understanding he felt something shift. Something he wasn't ready to name, but was becoming too real to ignore. Isabella stood on the small balcony of her rented penthouse apartment, the city lights spreading out below her like a carpet of fallen stars. The air was cool and crisp, but she didn't feel it. She was wrapped in a cashmere throw, her mind miles away in a small second-floor walk-up that smelled of garlic and sawdust. She had lied to Liam, not with malice, but with omission. She wasn't a writer on sabbatical. She was Isabella Vance, the sole heir to the Vance Global Industries fortune, a conglomerate with its hands in everything from tech to real estate. She was the woman on the cover of business magazines, the one who ran a multi-billion-dollar foundation, the Harbor Light Foundation she had left. That world behind, 2 months ago, walking away from a boardroom battle that had left her feeling hollow and disillusioned. Her father, a man who valued legacy above all, had demanded she take a more public role after a scandal involving one of their subsidiaries. He wanted her to be the face of the company, the polished symbol of their company continued strength. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't stand on another stage and read another carefully crafted speech about a future she didn't believe in. So she ran. She'd packed a bag, emptied a personal account, and disappeared, choosing this quiet, forgotten city, because it was the last place anyone would think to look for her. She had been content in her anonymity until she saw Liam in that hospital waiting room. He was everything her world wasn't. Honest, raw, defined not by what he owned, but by who he loved. Paying his bill had been an impulse, an easy act for her, but a profound one for him. But as she got to know him, she realized the danger of that act, the power imbalance it created. The lie it was built on, he was starting to trust her, starting to let her into the small, precious world he had built with his daughter, and she was there under false pretenses. She looked down at the city below, a world she could control, a world she could buy and sell, and realized it meant nothing. Compared to the quiet warmth of Liam's small kitchen, she knew she had to tell him the truth, but the thought of it terrified her, because if she told him, she risked losing the Praspelison. One thing she hadn't known. She was looking for a place to feel real. The workshop was Liam's sanctuary, the one place where the world and its demands seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the smell of fresh-cut wood. And the steady rhythm of his work, he was planing a piece of maple. His movements sure and practiced. When the bell above the door chimed, Isabella stood there holding a small box tied with twine. Her expression was serious, more so than he'd ever seen it. "Can we talk?" she asked. He switched off the planer, the sudden silence of the shop feeling heavy. He nodded, motioning to a pair of worn stools in the corner. They sat facing each other, the air thick with unspoken tension. "I haven't been honest with you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Liam waited, his hands resting on his knees, his knuckles white. "I'm not a writer. I mean, I've tried, but that's not what I do." She took a deep breath. "My name is Isabella Vance. My family owns Vance Global, And I run our foundation. The Harbor Light Foundation. Liam's expression didn't change, but a stillness came over him, a deep quiet that was more telling than any outburst. He just stared at her, his eyes searching her face as the pieces clicked into place. The hospital bill. He said it wasn't a question. She nodded. Yes, that was me. Liam stood up and walked a few paces away, his back to her. He ran a hand over his face, rubbing his tired eyes. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was something else, something colder, a hollow feeling of being played, of being seen as a project, a charity case. I didn't do it out of pity, she said quickly, standing as well. I did it because I saw you with your daughter, and I saw how much you loved her, and it was the most real thing I had seen in years. And you didn't think to tell me, Liam said, turning to face her. His voice was low, but it cut through the air. You let me invite you into my home. You ate dinner at my table. You played with my daughter, all while holding this secret. He gestured around the workshop. This is all I have. This honesty, this quiet, and you brought a lie into it. It wasn't a lie. Isabella's voice cracked. I was trying to be someone else, someone who wasn't defined by a bank account. I just wanted to see what it felt like to be liked for me, not for my name. Liam shook his head slowly, the look in his eyes. It was one of deep disappointment, a look that hurt more than anger ever could. Well, congratulations, he said, his voice flat. You got what you wanted. And with that, he turned back to his workbench, picked up a piece of sandpaper, and began to work. As if she were no longer there, the sound of the sanding was the only thing that filled the silence, a rough, steady rhythm that was his way of building a wall between them, brick by brick. Isabella stood there for a long moment, watching his back, the broad shoulders, now tense and unyielding. She had known this would be the reaction. She had feared it, but the reality of it was a physical blow. She set the small box she had brought on a nearby table and turned to leave. He didn't stop her. He didn't look up. The bell above the door chimed softly as she walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving him alone in the quiet, dust-filled air of his sanctuary. A sanctuary she had unintentionally violated. The days that followed the revelation were silent and gray. The sky seemed to mirror the mood that had settled over Liam's small world. He threw himself into his work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, arriving at the workshop before sunrise and staying long after the sun had set. He didn't want to think. He didn't want to feel. He just wanted the familiar comfort of wood and tools, the simple logic of a straight line and a solid joint. But Isabella's presence lingered like the scent of varnish in the air. He saw her everywhere in the park, where Maya now swung on the swings alone, in the small bakery where he stopped for coffee, and remembered her quiet laughter. He even found the orchid she had brought to his apartment, still blooming on the windowsill, a delicate, persistent reminder of what he had pushed away. Maya felt the shift too. She was quieter, more withdrawn. She didn't ask about Isabella directly, but her drawings told the story. The stick-figure family of two that she used to draw now had a third figure, scribbled out, a ghost of a person who used to be there. One evening, Liam found her sitting at the kitchen table, a half-finished drawing in front of her. "Are you mad at her?" she asked, her voice. Small Liam sat down beside her, his heart aching. "No, kiddo, I'm not mad," he said, and it was the truth. He wasn't mad. He was hurt and scared and confused, but not mad. "Then why doesn't she come over anymore?" "Because grown-ups are complicated," he said, stroking her hair. "Sometimes we build walls to keep ourselves safe, even when it keeps out the good things too." Maya looked down at her drawing, then back at him. "But she made you smile." He didn't have an answer for that because it was true. She had made him smile. She had made him feel a spark of hope he thought had been extinguished long ago. He had pushed her away to protect his pride, to protect his small, honest world. But as he sat there, in the quiet of his apartment with his daughter's sad eyes looking up at him, he wondered if in his attempt to keep them safe, he had just locked them inside an even smaller cage. Inside the workshop, a small box sat on the edge of a workbench. Unopened Liam had moved it a dozen times, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to throw it away. It was a tangible piece of the lie of the woman he was trying so hard to forget. One rainy afternoon, when the workshop felt particularly empty, he finally picked it up. The twine came undone, easily, and he lifted the lid inside. Nestled on a bed of soft tissue paper was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. Its wings were outstretched as if in mid-flight, and the detail was exquisite, far too fine. For an amateur, he turned it over and saw a small inscription on the bottom. For the man who builds things that last. Liam's breath caught in his throat. It was a piece of his own work, one he had sold at a craft fair years ago, a piece he had been particularly proud of and had never seen again. He remembered the woman who had bought it, a quiet, older woman with kind eyes who had said it was for her granddaughter, a granddaughter who had lost her way and needed a reminder of what was real. He sank onto a stool, holding the small bird in his calloused hand. She hadn't just bought him off with a hospital bill, she had seen him long before he had ever seen her. She had understood his work, his passion, his heart. She hadn't been playing a game. She had been trying to find her way back to something he already had. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been so focused on the lie that he had missed the truth. She wasn't a billionaire playing. Pretend she was a woman who saw the value in a small wooden bird, in a father's love, in a life built on honesty, and he had pushed her away. He stood up, the bird still in his hand, and walked to the door. The rain was coming down in sheets, but he didn't care. He had to find her. He had to tell her that he had been wrong, that he had been a fool, that sometimes the most real things are the ones that scare you the most. The lobby of the Vance Global headquarters was a cathedral of glass and steel, a monument to power and wealth. Men and women in tailored suits moved with a quiet urgency, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Liam stood in the center of it all, dressed in his work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, and a jacket that was still damp from the rain. He held a small wooden bird in one hand and a resolve in his heart that felt both terrifying and right. He looked wildly out of place, a piece of rough-hewn wood, in a room of polished chrome, and everyone knew it. The receptionist, a woman with a sleek blonde bob and an expression of polite disdain, looked up from her computer and raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "May I help you?" she asked her. Tone suggesting she already knew the answer was no. "I'm here to see Isabella Vance," he said, his voice steady. Despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs, the receptionist's smile was thin and dismissive. "Miss Vance is in a board meeting. She doesn't take unscheduled appointments." Liam didn't move. "Then I'll wait." The receptionist's eyes narrowed security. A man in a dark suit materialized at his side. "Sir, if you don't have an appointment, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." But before Liam could respond, a voice cut through the air. A voice he had been hearing in his dreams for weeks. "It's okay, Robert. I'll take it from here." Isabella stood at the top of the grand staircase, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She was dressed in a sharp black suit, her hair pulled back in a tight chignon, a stark contrast to the woman who had sat on his floor and helped his daughter build a fort. She looked like she belonged here in this world of power and control, and yet her eyes were fixed on him, and in them he saw a flicker of the same vulnerability he had seen in his workshop. She descended the stairs, her heels clicking on the marble, each step a deliberate echo in the cavernous room. The entire lobby had fallen silent, everyone watching the unfolding. Liam met her at the bottom of the stairs. He held out his hand and opened it, revealing the small wooden bird. She gasped her composure. Cracking for a moment, "You kept it," she whispered. He nodded. "You were right," he said, his voice low, "and for her ears only. I build things that last, and I was a fool to think this wasn't one of them." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She just stared at him, at the man who had crossed worlds to find her at. The man who held a piece of her past and his future in the palm of his hand. The boardroom was silent. The dozen members of the board of directors seated around the long glass table, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disapproval. They had been in the middle of a tense discussion about quarterly projections when Isabella had abruptly left the room to meet the strange man in the lobby. Now she stood at the head of the table, Liam beside her, his presence a stark and undeniable disruption to their sterile world. Robert, the man who had tried to have Liam removed from the lobby, cleared his throat. "Isabella, if we could return to the matter at hand." "No." "Isabella," said her voice, calm but firm, "we're going to discuss a new matter, one that's long overdue." She looked around the table at the faces of the men and women who had known her since she was a child, who had watched her grow into the role they had designed for her for years. This company has been about one thing. Profit. We've acquired, we've expanded, we've optimized, but we've lost our way. We've forgotten that our greatest asset isn't our stock price, it's the people who work for us. And the communities we serve. A murmur went through the room. "But Isabella didn't waver. This man," she said, placing a hand on Liam's arm, "is a carpenter. He builds things with his hands, things that are honest and real and meant to last. He reminded me of what this company was supposed to be about, what my grandfather envisioned before it became about numbers on a spreadsheet." Robert scoffed. "Isabella, this is hardly the time or place for sentimentality. It's exactly the place." Isabella countered, her voice ringing with a newfound strength that surprised even herself. "I'm not just the face of this company anymore. I'm its heart and its conscience, and things are going to change starting today." She turned to Liam, his eyes full of a pride and love that anchored her. "In the storm, we're going to start a new initiative," she announced to the board. "The Builders fund a program to support artisans and craftspeople to invest in skills that are being lost, to invest in people who create beauty and value with their own two hands, and Mr. Morgan will be running it." Liam's eyes widened, but he didn't speak. He just looked at Isabella, seeing not the billionaire heiress, but the woman who saw the value in a small wooden bird and had decided to build a world around it. The stuffy boardroom with its polished table and panoramic city views had never felt more like a place of hope. The rain had stopped by the time they left the Vance Global building, the sun breaking through the clouds and casting a clean, bright light on the wet pavement. The city felt different to Liam, now not as a place of towering indifference, but as a place where a new beginning had been forged. They walked in silence for a while. Not an awkward silence, but a comfortable one. The kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. Isabella had changed out of her suit and into jeans and a sweater. Her hair was down. She had linked her arm through his. As they walked, Liam still held the small wooden bird in his pocket. Its smooth surface, a constant reminder of the journey that had brought them here. They stopped at a small park, a green oasis tucked between skyscrapers. Maya was there waiting, with a woman who Liam guessed was one of Isabella's staff. When Maya saw them, her face lit up and she ran into their arms, wrapping herself around both of their legs in a fierce hug. "Are you staying now?" she asked, looking up at Isabella, her voice full of a child's unwavering hope. Isabella knelt down and brushed a stray hair from Maya's face. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm staying for good." Liam watched them, a smile finally reaching his eyes. A real smile, one that wasn't shadowed by worry or fear. "You're sure about this?" he asked Isabella, standing to face him. "About the fund? About me running it?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. "You're the most honest man I've ever met, and this company needs your integrity, more than it needs another executive in a suit. But it's not just about the work." Liam, he met her gaze, understanding that this was about more than a job. This was about a life, a future, a family. "I love you," he said, the words coming out easy and natural for the first time. "I love you too," she replied, her voice thick, though with emotion. And as they stood there in the middle of the park with Maya holding both of their hands, the world seemed to fall away. There were no boardrooms, no hospital bills, no social divides. There was just the three of them. A family built. Not on wealth or status, but on a foundation of kindness, a shared past and a future. They would build together one honest piece at a time. The workshop was filled with light and the sound of laughter. The old dusty space had been transformed. The Builders Fund had given it new life, but it was the people inside who made it a home. Liam stood at a workbench, guiding a young boy's hands as he learned to use a chisel. His voice was patient, his smile. Easy Isabella sat nearby, sketching in a notebook, but her eyes kept drifting to Liam, and the group of children gathered around him. She had found her place not at the head of a boardroom table, but here, in the heart of something real and creative. Maya was at her own small workbench, sanding a piece of wood, her tongue sticking out in concentration. She was building a birdhouse, a lopsided but ambitious project that she was determined to finish on her own. The bell above the door chimed, and Liam looked up, expecting a new student or a parent, but it was Isabella's father. He stood in the doorway, leaning on a cane, his expression a mixture of pride and awe. He looked around the bustling workshop at the children's focused faces, at his daughter's serene smile, and he finally understood. "You've built something remarkable here," he said to Isabella. "We built it," Isabella corrected, looking at Liam, her eyes full of love. Later that evening, after the workshop was quiet and the stars had begun to appear in the clear night sky, Liam, Isabella, and Maya sat on the steps of their new home, a small house with a big yard that they had bought together. Maya was nestled between them, her head resting on Isabella's lap, fast asleep, a handmade wooden bird clutched in her hand. Liam wrapped his arm around Isabella, pulling her close. "You know," he said, his voice a low murmur, "I never thought this life was possible for me." Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never thought it was possible for me either, but they had founded a life built not on what they had, but on who they were. A life where a father's love was the greatest fortune, and a billionaire's kindness was the key that unlocked a future they never dared to dream of. And as they sat there under the endless sky, they knew they were finally home. A single dad is heartbroken when he can't afford a puppy for his daughter's birthday. What he doesn't know is that the woman who runs the shelter is a lonely billionaire who sees something in him that money can't buy. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The air in the animal shelter smelled of clean pine shavings and a faint undercurrent of hope, a scent that clung to the concrete floors and the chain-link doors of the kennels. Ethan stood in the main corridor, one hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, his heart. A heavy stone in his chest. Chloe, his 7-year-old daughter, was pressed against the glass of a puppy enclosure, her breath fogging a small circle on the surface inside a small golden retriever, mix with oversized paws, and a perpetually hopeful tail wagged furiously. His fur was the color of honey, and his eyes were dark pools of unconditional love. Chloe had been talking about this puppy for months, ever since she'd seen a photo of him on the shelter's website. She'd named him Barnaby. She'd drawn pictures of him. She'd planned out their entire future of park visits and belly rubs. "Look, Daddy, he knows me," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Ethan forced a smile, his throat tight. He knew he did. "She's a good boy." He said the words, feeling like a betrayal. Every time he said them, he had $53 in his checking account, and rent was due on Friday. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, a job that offered flexibility, but no security. Clients were slow to pay, and new projects were scarce. A puppy wasn't just a puppy, it was food, vet bills, toys. It was a mountain of expenses. He had no way to climb. The adoption fee alone was more than he could afford, but telling her that her one birthday wish was impossible felt like failing her in the most fundamental way. A woman stood at the far end of the hall quietly, observing them. She was dressed in a simple pair of overalls, a faded t-shirt underneath her dark hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She looked like any other volunteer, tired but dedicated. What Ethan didn't know was that this woman, Ilara Vance, wasn't a volunteer. She owned the shelter. She had funded its construction from the ground up, and she was watching the scene unfold with a familiar ache in her heart. She had seen this quiet desperation before, but there was something about the way Ethan looked at his daughter with a base love, so fierce, it was almost painful, that made her step forward. "He's a special one, isn't he?" she said. Her voice calm and gentle. Ethan turned startled. He hadn't heard her approach. "Yeah, he is. Chloe's the best. He's my birthday wish." Ilara knelt down to Chloe's level. "Well, Barnaby is a very lucky puppy to have someone who wants him so much." Chloe beamed, but Ethan's smile faltered the weight of the truth. Pressing down on him, he knew in a few minutes he'd have to break his daughter's heart, and he didn't know how he was going to survive it. The adoption counselor, a kind-faced woman named Sarah, called them over to her desk. She had a bright smile and a stack of paperwork that made Ethan's stomach clench. He sat down with Chloe on his lap, trying to keep his breathing steady. As Sarah went over the adoption process, she talked about microchips and vaccination schedules and the importance of a good diet. Ethan nodded along, pretending to listen, but his mind was a whirlwind of numbers that didn't add up. Sarah slid a form across the desk. "This is just the application and the adoption agreement. The fee is $250, which covers all of his initial vet care." Ethan stared at the number. It might as well have been $1 million. He felt Chloe shift in his lap, her small body tense with excitement. He had to say something, anything, to stop this from going further. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. We're just looking today," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We're not quite ready to make a decision." Chloe's face fell, her bright, hopeful expression crumpling into confusion. "But Daddy, you said we could get him for my birthday." "I know, sweetheart," Ethan whispered, pulling her close. "But we have to be sure it's the right time." The disappointment in her eyes was a physical blow. He felt it in his chest, a sharp, painful ache. He stood up his legs, feeling unsteady. "I'm sorry to have wasted your time," he said to Sarah, who was now looking at him with an expression of gentle understanding. "It's no waste of time," she replied softly. "He's a great dog. He'll be here when you're ready." But Ethan knew they would never be ready, not in the way that mattered. He took Chloe's hand and led her out of the shelter, the sound of Barnaby's hopeful yelps following them like a sad goodbye. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear to see the hope fading from the puppy's eyes, just as it had from his daughter's. Ilara watched them go from the doorway of her small office, her heart twisting with a familiar pain. She had built this shelter to create happy endings, to bring families together. But she couldn't control the financial realities that kept so many people from experiencing the simple joy of a pet's love. She saw the shame in Ethan's eyes, the way he tried to shield his daughter from his own heartbreak. It was a look she knew all too well, not from her own life, but from the countless stories she had heard from people seeking help. From her foundation, a quiet dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. She walked over to Sarah's desk, her expression thoughtful. "Is the golden retriever mix still available?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, poor guy. The dad seemed so heartbroken." Ilara tapped her pen against the counter. "What if the adoption fee was waived?" Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "We can't do that, Ilara. It's against policy." "Policies can be changed," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. She pulled out a checkbook from her desk drawer, the Vance Foundation's logo printed subtly in the corner. "I'll cover it, and another 50 adoptions. After that, just tell them it's a special promotion, a Home for the Holidays fund." "Something." Sarah stared at her boss, her eyes wide with surprise. But why? Ilara looked toward the window, where Ethan's old beat-up car was pulling out of the lot. "Because some families are worth breaking the rules for," she said softly. "And because no little girl should have her heart broken on her birthday." The drive home was silent, the kind of silence that was heavy with unspoken disappointment. Chloe stared out the window, her reflection, a small, sad ghost against the passing landscape. She didn't cry. She just retreated into a quiet world of her own, a world where birthday wishes didn't come true. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly. His knuckles were white. He felt like a failure, a fraud. He had built up her hopes only to tear them down, and the shame of it was a bitter taste in his mouth. He wanted to explain, to tell her about the bills, about the slow clients, about the constant worry that kept him up at night. But how could he burden her with that? She was just a child. She deserved a world of magic and puppies, not a world of financial anxieties and broken promises. When they got back to their small apartment, the quiet, lingered Chloe went straight to her room and closed the door softly behind her. Ethan sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The silence of the apartment felt immense, a stark contrast to the happy chaos a new puppy would have brought. He stayed there for a long time, the afternoon light fading outside the window, until his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, and he almost ignored it. But something made him answer. "Hello," a cheerful voice asked. "Is this Ethan?" "Yes, this is Sarah from the animal shelter. I know you said you were just looking, but I wanted to let you know about a special promotion. We're running Ethan's—" Heart sank even further. "Look, I appreciate it, but I told you we're not." "I understand," Sarah said quickly, "but this is a bit different. A private donor just started a pay-it-forward fund. They've sponsored the adoption fees. For the next several dozen animals, including Barnaby, his fee has been completely waived." Ethan sat up straight. "What waived?" she repeated. "It's covered. All you'd need to handle are his ongoing expenses like food, but the initial adoption is free. We just want to see him go to a good home, and we all thought of you and Chloe immediately." Liam was speechless. He didn't know what to say. Who would do something like that? Why, it felt like a miracle, a random act of kindness that was too good to be true. But the hope in Sarah's voice was real. He thought of Chloe alone in her room, her heart broken. He thought of the little golden puppy with the hopeful eyes, and he knew he couldn't let this chance slip away. "I'll be there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be there in 20 minutes," when he told Chloe. Her face transformed the sadness, melting away into pure, unadulterated joy. She threw her arms around his neck and squeezed so tightly he could barely breathe. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you." Ethan held her close, his eyes stinging with tears. He didn't know who the anonymous donor was, but they hadn't just paid for a puppy. They had given him back his daughter's smile, and for that he would be eternally grateful. The second time they walked into the shelter, the air felt different. It was lighter, filled with a sense of possibility that hadn't been there. Before Chloe practically skipped through the door, her hand in Ethan's, her face glowing with an excitement that was contagious, Barnaby was waiting for them, his tail a blur of happy motion as they approached the enclosure. When Sarah opened the door, the puppy bounded out and straight into Chloe's arms, licking her face with a joyous abandon that made everyone in the room smile. Ethan knelt down and ruffled the puppy's soft fur, his heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it almost hurt. He looked around the shelter, searching for a clue, for a sign of the person who had made this moment possible, but there was no one, just the usual hum of volunteers and the happy yelps of animals waiting for their forever homes. Alara watched from the doorway of the supply closet, her heart aching with a strange mixture of joy and longing. She had told herself she was just doing a good deed, a simple act of charity, but seeing the look on Ethan's face, the way he watched his daughter, with a love that was so pure and so powerful, it stirred something deep inside her. She had everything money could buy: a penthouse, apartment, a portfolio of successful investments, a life of luxury and freedom. But she didn't have that. She didn't have that quiet, simple connection that made a small apartment feel like a home, a beat-up car feel like an adventure. She saw Ethan look her way, and she quickly stepped back into the shadows, not wanting to be seen, not wanting to break the spell of the moment, She had created this happiness, but she felt like an outsider looking at a ghost in her own life as Ethan and Chloe left the shelter with Barnaby. Trotting happily beside them on a bright new leash, Alara felt a pang of loneliness so sharp it took her breath away. She had given them a gift, but they had given her something far more valuable, a glimpse of what she had been missing all along, a reminder that the most precious things in life could never be bought. Only felt the next few weeks were a whirlwind of happy chaos. Barnaby filled their small apartment with a warmth and energy that had been missing for too long. He chewed on shoes, left muddy paw prints on the floor, and woke them up at dawn with wet-nosed nudges, and Ethan wouldn't have traded it for anything. He found a part-time job walking dogs in his neighborhood to cover the extra expenses, and the new routine gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. He and Chloe spent their afternoons at the park, throwing a bright red ball for Barnaby, and their evenings curled up on the couch, the three of them a small, perfect family, one sunny afternoon. While they were at the dog park, Ethan saw a familiar face. Alara was sitting on a bench, a sketchbook in her lap, her dark hair catching the sunlight. She was so focused on her drawing that she didn't notice him until Barnaby bounded over and dropped his slobbery ball at her feet. She looked up startled, then a slow smile spread across her face. "Well, hello there," she said, scratching the puppy behind the ears. "I think I know you." Ethan walked over his heart, doing a strange little flip in his chest. "Fancy meeting you." "Here," Alara chuckled. "I come here sometimes for inspiration. It's a good place to people watch and dog watch." He sat down on the bench beside her, a comfortable silence settling between them. "Never got a chance to thank you," he said finally, his voice low. Ilara's smile faltered. "For what? For the promotion at the shelter?" "I know it was you," he said, looking at her directly. "I don't know why you did it, but it changed everything for us." Alara looked down at her sketchbook, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I just saw a good dog who needed a good home," she said evasively. But Ethan knew it was more than that. He saw the loneliness in her eyes, the same quiet ache he had seen that first day in the shelter, and he felt a sudden protective urge to understand the woman who had so selflessly changed his life. "So, you're a full-time philanthropist?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice. She laughed, a genuine sound that made him smile. "Something like that," she said. "But I'm still trying to figure out what it all means." They sat there for a long time, talking about everything and nothing the way strangers do when they are on the verge, kind of becoming something more. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Ethan realized he wasn't just grateful to Alara. He was drawn to her quiet strength, to her hidden kindness, to the mystery that surrounded her like a soft-spoken promise. Alara found herself drawn to the dog park more and more often, not just for the inspiration, but for the chance to see Ethan and Chloe. Their weekly encounters became a comforting ritual, a small island of normalcy in her otherwise solitary life. She learned that Ethan was a talented artist, his sketches filled with a life and emotion that she envied. She learned about his dreams of one day opening his own small studio, a place where he could teach kids to draw and paint. He learned that Alara had a quick wit, a dry sense of humor, and a surprising knowledge of obscure comic books. He learned that she had traveled the world, but had never really found a place that felt like home. Didn't press her for details about her past, and she was grateful for that. With him, she wasn't Alara Vance, the billionaire heiress. She was just Alara, a woman with a sketchbook and a soft spot for golden retrievers. One afternoon, as they sat on their usual bench watching Barnaby chase, a butterfly Chloe ran up to them with a fistful of dandelions. "Here," she said, handing one to each of them. "Make a wish." Ethan smiled and blew on his, the white seeds scattering in the wind. "What did you wish for?" Chloe asked Alara. "He can't tell you," Alara said, winking at Chloe. "Or it won't come true." But as she blew on her own dandelion, her wish was simple and clear. She wished for more days like this, more moments of quiet joy, more of the feeling that she was finally exactly where she was supposed to be. The truth came out in the most mundane of ways. A crumpled magazine in the waiting room of a dentist's office, Ethan had taken Chloe for her. 6-month checkup, and was flipping through a stack of outdated publications to pass the time when he saw her face. Her picture was part of a feature on the country's most influential philanthropists. The headline read, "Elara Vance, the quiet power behind the Vance Foundation." Ethan stared at the photo, his heart sinking. It was her, the same dark eyes, the same thoughtful expression, but she was dressed in a tailored suit, her hair styled perfectly, her posture exuding a confidence and power. He had never seen the article detailed her family's immense wealth, her father's corporate empire, her own decision to step away from the family business to run their charitable foundation. It mentioned her recent disappearance from the public eye, her reputation as a fiercely private and enigmatic figure. It all clicked into place. The anonymous donation, the expensive sketchbook, the way she always seemed to have an answer for everything she eyed. Wasn't just a kind woman with a soft spot for dogs, she was one of the wealthiest women in the world. He felt a wave of something cold and sharp wash over him. It wasn't anger, it was a feeling of being foolish, of being naive. He had let her into his life, into his daughter's life, without ever really knowing who she was. He had allowed himself to dream of a future with a woman who lived in a world so far removed from his own. It was laughable when Chloe came out of the dentist's office, her smile bright and proud. Ethan forced himself to return it, but the easy warmth between them was gone, replaced by a new and heavy silence. He didn't confront Elara right away. He needed time to process, to understand, but the next time he saw her at the park, he couldn't hide the distance in his eyes, the wall that had gone up around his heart, and Elara, a woman who was used to reading the subtle cues of powerful people, knew immediately that something was wrong. She just didn't know what it was. The confrontation happened a few days later. On a gray and drizzly afternoon, Elara found Ethan at the Radaran dog park, sitting alone on their bench, staring out at the empty field. He didn't look up when she approached. His shoulders were slumped. His expression guarded. Elara sat down beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know who you are," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Elara's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan, I was going to tell you," when he said, turning to face her. His eyes were filled with a mixture of hurt and disappointment that was more painful than anger. "When were you going to tell me? After you got tired of playing pretend? After you got bored with our simple little life?" "I wasn't playing pretend," Elara said, her voice trembling. "I was trying to be real for once in my life. Real." Ethan scoffed. "What's real about hiding the fact that you could buy this entire city with your pocket change? I didn't want you to treat me differently," he did. "I wanted you to see me, not my bank account." "I did see you," Ethan said, his voice softening slightly. "I saw a kind, funny woman who made my daughter laugh and who made me believe that maybe I could be happy again. But now I don't know what was real and what was just a part of your game. It wasn't a game." Elara insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "I was falling in love with you." Ethan's expression faltered, the anger draining away, to be replaced by a deep and aching sadness. "I can't do this, Elara," he said, standing up. "I can't be a part of your world. I don't fit, and I won't let my daughter get her heart broken when you inevitably realize the same thing." He walked away, leaving her alone on the bench, the rain starting to fall in earnest, mingling with the tears that now streamed down her face. She had run away from her life of wealth and privilege, only to have it follow her and destroy the one thing that had ever made her feel truly alive. The weeks that followed were a blur of empty days and lonely nights. Elara retreated into her penthouse, a gilded cage that had never felt more like a prison. She ignored the calls from her foundation, from her father, from the friends who didn't really know her. She spent her days sketching faces from memory. Ethan's thoughtful frown, Chloe's bright smile, Barnaby's hopeful eyes, her sketchbook filled with a life she had lost. Ethan threw himself into his work, taking on more projects than he could handle anything to keep his mind from wandering to the woman who had turned his world upside down. He and Chloe still went to the park, but it felt different. Now haunted by the ghost of a future that had been stolen from them, Chloe was the one who finally broke the silence. She found Ethan one night sitting alone in the dark, staring at a blank computer screen. "Daddy," she said, her voice small and sad. "Do you miss her?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He just stared at the screen, the cursor, blinking like a tiny, relentless heartbeat. "Yeah, kiddo," he finally whispered. "I do, me too," Chloe said, climbing into his lap. "I miss her laugh, and the way she smelled like rain and dog biscuits." Ethan held his daughter close his heart, aching with a love so fierce. It was almost unbearable. He had pushed Alara away to protect Chloe, but in doing so he had broken both of their hearts. He had been so afraid of not being enough that he hadn't considered the possibility that he was exactly what she needed. The next morning, he found the sketchbook. Alara had left it on his doorstep sometime in the night. There was no note, no explanation, just the worn, leather-bound book filled with her drawings. He flipped through the blank that the Gadawanto pages his breath, catching in his throat. She had captured them all with a startling clarity and emotion. The way Chloe's hair curled behind her ears, the way Barnaby's tail wagged when he was happy, the way his own eyes crinkled at the corners. When he smiled at the back of the book, there was a single drawing he hadn't seen before. It was a sketch of a small studio, a bright and airy space, with easels and paint supplies, and a sign above the door that read the Barnaby Art Collective for Kids Who Dream in Color. Underneath it was a small note. "My wish." It was a wish for him, for his dream, for a future. He had been too afraid to imagine for himself in that moment. Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't let fear win. He couldn't let his pride stand in the way of a love that was so real and so rare. He had to find her. He had to tell her that he was ready to dream with her. The Vance Foundation Gala was the most exclusive event of the year. A glittering affair attended by the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures. Ethan stood outside the grand ballroom, dressed in a rented tuxedo that felt stiff and unfamiliar. He looked completely out of place, a small boat in a sea of yachts, but he didn't care. He had a mission. He took a deep breath and walked in the ballroom. Was a spectacle of crystal chandeliers and designer gowns, a symphony of clinking glasses and polite laughter. He scanned the crowd, searching for her face, and then he saw her. Alara stood on a small stage at the far end of the room, a microphone in her hand. She was dressed in a stunning black gown, her hair styled in a sleek chignon. She looked every bit the powerful heiress, the woman from the magazine, but her eyes were sad. Her smile forced she was giving a speech about the Foundation's latest initiative, her voice clear and confident, but devoid of the warmth he had come to know and love. He started to walk toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. A security guard stepped in his way. But before he could say anything, a small figure darted past him. It was Chloe, dressed in her best party dress, her hair tied with a bright red ribbon. She ran onto the stage and straight into Alara's arms. Alara gasped, startled. Then her composure crumbled, and she dropped to her knees, hugging the little girl tightly. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I miss you too," Chloe replied. "I brought you something." She held out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing of the three of them holding hands with Barnaby at their feet in a big, messy scrawl. She had written "our family." Alara stared at the drawing, tears streaming down her face. She looked up and saw Ethan standing at the edge of the stage, his eyes filled with a love and a hope that mirrored her own. "I was wrong," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I was scared and I was a fool, but I'm not afraid anymore." He walked onto the stage and took her hand. "I love you, Alara Vance. And I don't care if you're a billionaire or a dog walker. I just want to be with you." Alara stood up, her face glowing with a joy that outshone all the diamonds in the room. "I love you too," she said, and she kissed him, a long, passionate kiss that was a promise of a future they would build together. The Damans crowd erupted in applause, but they didn't hear it. They were in their own world, a world where love was the only currency that mattered. The Barnaby Art Collective opened on a sunny Saturday in the heart of the city. The small studio was bright and airy, filled with the smell of fresh paint and the sound of children's laughter. Easels were set up in a circle, each with a small canvas and a set of paints. Ethan stood in the center of the room, a smudge of blue on his cheek, his eyes shining with a pride and a joy he had never known. Alara was by his side, her hand in her face glowing with a happiness that was more beautiful than any designer gown. Chloe was at her own easel, her tongue sticking out in concentration. As she painted a vibrant and chaotic masterpiece, Barnaby lay at her feet, his tail thumping a steady rhythm on the floor. This was their dream, their future, their family. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, it was a real life beginning, a testament to the power of love, kindness, and the courage to take a leap of faith, because sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in boardrooms or bank vaults, but in the messy, beautiful, and unexpected corners of the human heart. And as Ethan looked at Alara and Chloe, he knew he was the richest man in the world. He was a single dad, struggling to raise his daughter when he found a lost dog in the rain. What he didn't know was that the dog's owner was a reclusive billionaire who had given up on ever finding happiness again. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching? From the rain fell in a steady, relentless curtain, blurring the edges of the city into a watercolor of gray and neon. Jacob hurried down the slick pavement, one hand holding a cheap umbrella that was threatening to turn inside out, and the other firmly gripping his daughter's small hand. Mia, his 6-year-old daughter, skipped beside him, her bright yellow rain boots splashing in the puddles, her laughter a small, bright sound in the otherwise dreary evening. They were on their way home from the library, their weekly ritual, a small island of peace in their often chaotic lives. Jacob was a carpenter, his hands calloused and strong, but work had been slow, and the bills were piling up like autumn leaves. He tried to shield Mia from his worries, to create a world for her that was filled with stories and magic, not a world of overdue notices and quiet desperation. As they turned onto their street, a small, shivering shape caught Jacob's eye. It was a dog, a small, scruffy terrier mix, huddled under a bush, its fur matted and soaked its eyes wide with fear. It had no collar, no tags. It was just a small, lost soul in the middle of a storm. Mia stopped, her eyes widening with a mixture of pity and wonder. "Daddy, look, it's all alone." Jacob hesitated. He didn't have the time or the money for a stray dog, but he couldn't just leave it there in the cold rain. He knelt down, his voice soft and gentle. "Hey there, little guy. It's okay, we're not going to hurt you." The dog whimpered, but didn't run. It just shivered its small body, trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. Jacob reached out his hand slowly, and the dog hesitantly licked his fingers, a small sign of trust in a world that had clearly let it down. He scooped the dog up into his arms, its small body warm and trembling against his chest. "Come on," he said to Mia. "Let's get him out of the rain." They took the dog back to their small apartment, a second-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better days. Jacob dried the dog with a towel, while Maya filled a bowl with water. The dog drank greedily, its tail giving a small, hopeful wag. Jacob knew he couldn't keep the dog, but for tonight at least it was safe and warm and loved. What he didn't was that this small act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Across town, in a sprawling penthouse apartment that overlooked the city, a woman stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Her name was Genevieve Claremont, and she was one of the wealthiest women in the world. She had built a tech empire from the ground up, her name synonymous with innovation and success, but her life was as empty as the cavernous apartment she called home. Her phone buzzed with notifications from her board, from her investors, from the dozens of people who wanted a piece of her time and her fortune, but she ignored them all. She just stared out at the rain, her heart aching with a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight. A year ago, she had lost the only thing that had ever brought her true joy. Her small terrier, Mix Winston. He had disappeared from her backyard one afternoon. And despite a massive search and a heartbreakingly large reward, he was never found. Genevieve had never given up hope, but as the months turned into a year, a part of her had started to close off, to retreat into a world of work and solitude. She had forgotten what it felt like to love something unconditionally, to have a reason to come home. At the end of the day, she didn't know it yet, but miles away in a small, cramped apartment, a kind-hearted carpenter and Harp, his daughter, were unknowingly holding the key to her happiness. The small terrier Mix, whom Mia had promptly named Lucky, slept soundly on a pile of old blankets in the corner of the living room, his small body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Jacob and Mia sat on the floor beside him, watching him with a mixture of awe and affection. "He's so cute," Mia whispered, her chin resting on her knees. Jacob smiled, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, he is, but we can't keep him." "Sweetheart, we have to try to find his owner." Mia's face fell, but she nodded bravely. "I know, but can he stay with us until we do?" "Of course," Jacob said, pulling her into a hug the next morning. Jacob took Lucky to the local vet to see if he was microchipped. He was the vet technician. Scanned the small chip in the dog's neck, and a name and address popped up on the screen. Winston Claremont. The address was for a penthouse apartment in the wealthiest part of the city. Jacob's heart sank. He had been secretly hoping the dog was a stray, that he could find a way to keep him, but it was clear that this was no ordinary dog. This was the beloved pet of a very wealthy and powerful person. He called the number. Listed on the microchip, a crisp professional voice answered Genevieve Claremont's office. "How may I direct your call?" Jacob hesitated, his voice suddenly feeling rough and out of place. I think I found Miss Claremont's dog." The assistant's tone immediately shifted from bored to urgent. "Mr. Winston, where did you find him? How is he?" Jacob explained the story, and the assistant arranged for a car to pick him, and lucky up an hour later a sleek black car pulled up in front of his apartment building. The driver, a stoic man in a dark suit, opened the door for him. Jacob and Lucky climbed into the back. The plush leather seats, a stark contrast to the worn fabric of his own truck as they drove through the city. Jacob felt a growing sense of dread. He was about to enter a world. He didn't belong to a world of wealth and power that was so far removed from his own. It was intimidating when they arrived at the penthouse. Building a doorman in a crisp uniform greeted them and led them to a private elevator. The doors opened directly into Genevieve's apartment, a sprawling space with breathtaking views of the city. The apartment was beautifully decorated, but it felt cold and sterile, like a museum, not a home. Genevieve stood by the window. Her back to them, she was dressed in a simple but elegant silk blouse and tailored trousers. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. When she turned around, her eyes fell on the small dog in Jacob's arms. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled. "Winston," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt down, and the dog bounded into her arms, licking her face with a joyous abandon that brought tears to her eyes. Genevieve held her dog close, her heart aching with a love she thought she had lost forever. She looked up at Jacob, her eyes shining with a dog gratitude that was so profound. It was almost painful. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have no idea what this means to me." Jacob just nodded, suddenly, feeling like an intruder in this intensely private moment. He had returned a lost dog, but he had also unknowingly returned a piece of a lonely woman's heart. The next few days were a blur of awkward gratitude and unexpected connection. Genevieve insisted on rewarding Jacob for finding Winston, but he politely refused her offers of money. He didn't want to be paid for doing the right thing, but he did agree to let her take him and Mia out for dinner as a thank you. They went to a small Italian restaurant in their neighborhood, a place with plush, red-checkered tablecloths and a cozy family atmosphere. Genevieve was clearly out of her element, but she seemed to enjoy the simple authenticity of the place. She listened intently as Mia chattered on about school and her friends, and she laughed, a genuine warm laugh that surprised Jacob. She told them about her own childhood, a lonely and isolated one spent in boarding schools and empty mansions. She talked about her love for Winston, how he had been her only real companion for years. As the evening wore on, Jacob saw a different side of Genevieve. She wasn't just a powerful CEO, she was a woman who was just as lonely and vulnerable as he was. She was just better at hiding it behind a wall of wealth and success. After dinner, they walked through the park. The city lights twinkling around them, Maya ran ahead chasing fireflies, her laughter echoing in the quiet night. Genevieve and Jacob walked side by side, a comfortable silence settling between them. "I haven't felt this relaxed in years," Genevieve said, her voice soft and thoughtful. Jacob smiled. "I know what you mean. It's easy to forget what's important when you're caught up in the stress of everyday life." They stood there for a long time, watching Maya play, her small figure, a beacon of joy in the darkness. And in that moment, Jacob realized that he was drawn to Genevieve not because of her wealth or her power, but because of the quiet strength and the hidden kindness he saw in her eyes. He was falling for her, and the thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and Genevieve found herself at Jacob's small apartment once again. She had brought over a box of art supplies for Mia, a peace offering for interrupting their weekend. But the truth was, she just wanted an excuse to see them again. She sat on the floor with Mia, her expensive silk blouse now smudged with finger paint as they created a colorful and chaotic masterpiece. Jacob sat on the couch, watching them, a small smile playing on his lips. He was amazed at how easily Genevieve had fit into their lives. She was a natural, with Mia patient and kind, and genuinely interested in her endless stories. Later, after Mia had fallen asleep on the couch, her head in Genevieve's lap, they talked in hushed tones, their voices a soft murmur in the quiet apartment. "You're really good with her," Jacob said, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. Genevieve smiled, her eyes soft as she looked down at the sleeping child. "She's easy to love. It's you," Jacob said. "She sees the good in you, the part you try to hide from the world." Genevieve's smile faded, her eyes filled with a sadness that Jacob had never seen before. "It's not that simple," she said. "I've built my life around being strong and independent. I don't know how to let people in." Jacob reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Maybe you don't have to," he said. "Maybe you just have to let the right person in." They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped together, a silent promise passing between them. And in that moment, Genevieve knew that she was falling in love with Jacob, not because he was a hero who had rescued her dog, but because he was a kind and gentle man who had rescued her heart. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of secret dates and stolen moments. Genevieve would sneak away from her office to meet Jacob for lunch at a small diner. In his neighborhood, they would take Mia to the park on weekends, and for a few precious hours they were just a normal family. It was a fantasy, a beautiful and fragile bubble that they both knew couldn't last forever. The real world was always there, waiting to intrude. One afternoon, a photographer from a gossip magazine spotted them at the park the next day. Their picture was on the cover of every tabloid in the country. The headline read, "Billionaire CEO Genevieve, Claremont's secret romance with a blue-collar carpenter." The story was a sensation, a modern-day Cinderella tale that captured the public's imagination. But for Genevieve and Jacob, it was a nightmare. Their private world had been shattered. Their love turned into a spectacle. Genevieve's board was furious. Her investors were nervous. And her father, a man who had always disapproved of her choices, was apoplectic. He saw Jacob as a threat, a gold digger who was after her fortune. Jacob was hounded by reporters, his small apartment besieged by a constant stream of cameras and questions. His quiet life had been turned upside down, and he didn't know how to handle the sudden and intense scrutiny. He started to pull away from Genevieve, to retreat into the familiar world of his workshop. the place where he felt safe and in control. He loved her, but he didn't know if he could survive in her world. The pressure was too much. The gap between their lives too wide. The breaking point came one evening when Jacob found a reporter trying to interview Mia at the park. He was furious, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. He confronted the reporter, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. That night he told Genevieve he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't subject his daughter to this kind of life. He loved her, but he had to let her go. Genevieve was heartbroken, but she understood she had brought this chaos into his life, and she couldn't ask him to sacrifice his peace and his daughter's well-being for her. She let him go, but a part of her went with him. She had finally found happiness, only to have it snatched away by the very world she had tried to escape. The days that followed were a blur of pain and regret. Genevieve threw herself into her work, a familiar and comforting distraction, but the joy was gone. Her life was once again a series of empty meetings and lonely nights. Jacob returned to his quiet life of carpentry and fatherhood, but the silence in his apartment was now a constant reminder of what he had lost. He missed Genevieve's laughter, her quick wit, but her quiet strength. He missed the way she looked at him, with a love that was so pure and so real. One evening he found a small wooden box on his doorstep. Inside was a single perfect white orchid and a small note that read, "I'm sorry. Love you." It was from Genevieve. And in that moment Jacob knew he had made a terrible mistake. He had let his fear and his pride stand in the way of the greatest love he had ever known. He had to get her back. He flew to her city without a break. Second thought, he found her at a charity gala, a glittering affair that was a world away from his own. He walked into the ballroom, his heart pounding in his chest, and he saw her standing on a stage, a vision in a black gown. She was beautiful, but she was also sad. Her eyes were empty, her smile forced. He walked onto the stage and took the microphone from her hand. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "I'm in love with this woman," he said, his voice ringing with a passion and a conviction that surprised even himself. "I don't care about her money or her power, I just care about her, and I was a fool to let her go." He turned to Genevieve, his eyes pleading, "I love you, Genevieve Claremont, and I'm not afraid anymore." Genevieve's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, a long, passionate kiss that was a promise of a future. They would build together. The crowd erupted in applause, but they didn't hear it. They were in their own world, a world where love was the only thing that mattered. They got married a few months later in a small private ceremony, surrounded by their closest friends and family. It wasn't a fairy tale wedding. It was something better. It was real. They built a life together, a life that was a beautiful blend of their two worlds. Genevieve continued to run her company, but she did it with a new sense of purpose and a new partner by her side. Jacob opened his own studio, a place where he could create his beautiful and honest work and teach a new generation of craftspeople. They were an unlikely pair, a billionaire and a carpenter, but they were also a perfect match, a testament to the power of love, to bridge any divide, to heal any wound, and to create a happiness that was more precious than any fortune in the world, because in the end, it's not about what you have, it's about who you have to share it with. And Genevieve and Jacob had found their greatest treasure in each other.